Hello and howdy everyone. Welcome to the nascent series on my channel, Doodles and Discourse, where I talk about books, TV shows, or whatever else I feel like talking about while drawing related fan art. So, obviously, in lieu of being timely or relevant, I'm beginning this series with a throwback to a fantasy series widely hailed as being a classic of YA literature, The Song of the Lioness by Tamora Pierce. Specifically, the first two books in the series, Alanna the First and In the Hand of the Goddess. Why? Well, for various wizard-related reasons, Tamora Pierce's name has been bandied about a bit more lately, at least in the circles I run in, as an author who writes fantasy series for children correctly. Or more correctly than some fantasy series that shall not be named anyway. The Song of the Lioness tends to get brought up in these discussions in particular because the series revolves around a young girl who disguises herself as a boy in order to become a knight. It's often hailed as being transgressive and gender critical and feminist, all that good stuff. But until the past week or so, I couldn't have said whether or not this was true. Despite having grown up more or less around these books, with dozens of friends singing their praises, I never read them. I won't bore you with the details of why they never made it to the top of my reading list. I'm not even sure there was a reason. I did read one of Tamora's Circle of Magic books back when those were new and liked it fine, but I later DNF'd her sort of sequel to The Song of the Lioness, Trickster's Choice, for reasons I genuinely don't remember at this point. All of this is really to say that prior to picking up the first book in The Song of the Lioness, again, Alanna the First Adventure, I didn't have a strong understanding of or opinion about Tamora's writing beyond what was being fed to me by cultural osmosis. But what I was being fed was intriguing. A book about a girl forced to explore her gender identity by masquerading as a boy to fulfill her dream of becoming a knight? Hell yeah, sign me up. A possibly weird amount of my favorite fantasy books have been about the same or very similar topics. Some of those, like The Blue Sword by Robin McKinley or The Vows and Honor duology by Mercedes Lackey, were even contemporary with this series. Given that both titles I just mentioned were also written for younger YA or YA adjacent audiences, I went into the series with a certain range of expectations. That was my mistake, really. So I'm going to pause for just 1 second to lay out a few things. First, I'd like to spoil the rest of the video by saying this up front. I like Alanna. Despite the critical nature of everything else I'm about to say, I like her just fine as a character, and I am interested in learning where she goes in the later half of the series. Second, if it isn't already blatantly obvious, I am no longer a young adult by any stretch. I read a lot of YA fiction, primarily because that's the genre many female fantasy writers get shoehorned into, even if their work doesn't belong there, as opposed to, like, the overly serious, or often overly serious, world of adult sci-fi and fantasy. That said, I do feel like the first two books in the series, at least, are better suited for middle grade readers, not young adults, based entirely on the writing style and the way subject matter is handled. But I'm pointing this out because I can't really speak to whether someone closer to their intended age range would enjoy the books or not, and I'm not here to try and guess. I'm coming at this specifically from an adult perspective, engaging with the nostalgia train as it whips past me. Finally, I want to point out that I'm well aware of the time period in which this series was written and published. The attitudes and understandings of gender presented in the book are not dissimilar to the ones I was raised with. While I strongly feel that the book doesn't hold up to contemporary standards on these matters, I'm not going to spend much time engaging with its lack of nuance, particularly not when the author herself has mentioned that she might have done a few things differently if she'd had the same information then that she has today. With that out of the way, For anyone who isn't already familiar, The Song of the Lioness is a 4-book series revolving around a girl named Alanna of Trabant. Alanna lives in a stock standard Renaissance fair fantasy world where all she wants to be is a knight who goes on adventures, but because she's a girl, she's about to get sent to a convent to learn magic instead. However, her twin brother, Tom, wants to be a mage, not a knight, and agrees to trade places with her. For anyone who, like me, immediately assumes that Tom will therefore pretend to be a girl, no, they simply rewrite the proverbial record to say that they were twin boys instead of a boy and a girl. That's not really a fault, I just found it mildly disappointing. As part of trading places, they loop 2 people in on their subterfuge. The healer woman who taught them magic and medicine through their childhood, but who never makes a notable appearance again, so I didn't bother remembering her name. And the manservant, Coram, who accompanies Alanna to the castle. Alanna renames herself Alan and successfully convinces everyone that her father is so neglectful as to forget who his children are or where he sent them, which admittedly is true to what little character their dad has. I just would have preferred to see something come of this lie, but we'll get to that later. From there, the plot meanders around for the first book, touching upon a schoolyard bully Alanna has to deal with, an 11-year-old saving the city from a plague, the Crown Prince's obviously evil cousin showing up, Alanna's first encounter with menstruation threatening her disguise, and finally lands at a random desert city where a cadre of immortal child-eating beings are trapped until Alanna and the Crown Prince destroy them? At the risk of once again getting ahead of myself, the book to me struggles heavily with plot structure. That ending is exactly as abrupt and out of nowhere as the summary makes it sound. The second book opens with informing us that Alanna's dad died between books, which no one cares about, and then she meets a goddess in the woods who wants to be her mother. The goddess gives her a very strange talk about crushes being a good and normal thing to have, actually, even though Alanna insists that she has no interest in such things. The goddess also gives Alanna a magic necklace and a talking cat, which turns out to be supremely helpful because most of this book's plot revolves around the Crown Prince's evil cousin trying to assassinate Alanna in various, almost comedically elaborate ways, all of which are foiled in large part by the super special magic necklace and or Deus Ex Kitty. In between assassination attempts, Alanna tries on a dress for the first time in years, is propositioned and assaulted to varying degrees by both of her best friends, one of whom she rewards with sex. There's a war for all of about 5 minutes, and at least one secondary character is introduced only to be brutally killed off a chapter later. At the end of all of this, Alanna passes her final test to become a knight, before promptly turning around and accusing the cousin of being obviously evil after finally putting in the bare minimum of effort to make a case against him, which is ultimately decided in a trial by combat wherein her true gender is revealed to absolutely no consequences whatsoever. And if I'm sounding like a tiny bit exasperated at this point, that's because I am. Recounting it has just made me remember how incredibly frustrating these books were to read. For every moment where something heartwarming was happening, it felt like there were 3 more moments where I was rolling my eyes over consequences that were failing to manifest, or tension being undercut by everyone's never-ending reasonableness, or the near-complete lack of foreshadowing, or how various characters' personalities seem to randomly change depending on the needs of the plot. I said earlier that I like Alanna just fine, and I mean, I like her, the character. At least, I do when she's acting like what I can only describe as herself. A hot-headed warrior who thinks with her sword, and not when she has sudden flashes of extreme intelligence where she clearly sees all the threads of the universe to justify how she does shit like curing an incurable plague. The whole thing is kind of a mess, is what I'm getting at, which is a large part of the reason why I stopped at book 2 in order to do this video. I want to document this, then see if my opinion changes after the next 2 books, which I am told are superior. And genuinely, they have to be. Like, after all, these were Tamora's first and second books, respectively. And already in the second book, you can see a clear, marked improvement over the first. For example, while certain parts of the second book's ending were ridiculous, sure, there is a clear progression of events which leads you to that confrontation, unlike in the first book. To be less circumspect about it, and I'm going full spoilers past this point, if spoilers can really be a thing for a 40-year-old series. At the end of this book, in the middle of a feast meant to celebrate Alanna's ascension to knighthood, Alanna gets a wild hair and slips away from the celebration to sneak into Roger, the obviously evil cousin's, quarters. Now, she is prompted to do this by noticing a trace of Roger's magic lingering around the queen as the queen's constitution takes a notable dip. It still seems a bit random because she's noticed this multiple times previously, and that ability to see that magic is specifically linked to the super special magic necklace that nobody else has, right? But anyway, once inside the suite, Alanna immediately finds what are effectively a series of voodoo dolls that are obviously being used for 2 purposes. 1, to cause the queen slow and painful death, and 2, to prevent anyone from seeing or remembering that they saw Roger's suspicious behavior. That last bit of information, the magic to obscure what he was doing from everyone around him, retroactively made the litany of scenes where Alanna ranted and raved to other characters, usually her mentor Miles, about how obviously evil Roger was, only for both characters to rehash the exact same conversation over and over again every few chapters, each time acting as though they'd never made these connections or complaints previously, made a whole lot more sense. For me, though, making sense didn't make them work. Like, this new bit of information, it didn't seem so much like a revelation, it just seemed like the author realized at the last minute that she'd written in the same confrontation scene 6 different times. So rather than go back and edit those scenes, she just pulled some drastically overpowered magic out of her bum to make the characters seem...
Hey, Editing Ray popping in here. The line was supposed to seem less stupid. It apparently got overwritten at some point in the editing process. My bad.
Obviously, your mileage may vary here, but personally, I would have rather had each confrontation scene come with a gradually increasing sense of deja vu, which then accumulated into the revelation that he was using magic to alter their memories, rather than the plot points being dropped cold turkey every single time they were erased, which, again, made me feel like the book was just poorly edited. But for all that the foreshadowing in the section is bad, it does exist. Comparatively, the ending of the first book went like this. In the last section of the book, Roger takes all the squires in the castle, plus Alanna, who was a page at the time, to a random desert territory of their kingdom which had never been mentioned previously. On their way there, he tells them that there's a place in this desert called the Black City, which all the indigenous people are terrified of because their young adults keep disappearing into it randomly in the middle of the night and never returning. Also, there's some kind of folktale / prophecy that the city is inhabited by immortal monsters who once ruled this kingdom, but were trapped by magic within the city once the folks there realized that their rulers were also eating their children. Other than the, questionably racist and pro-colonial undertones of literally everything about this section, which I'm not qualified to go into and I'm not going to try. This in and of itself is not a bad idea for a villain, but the confrontation as the accumulation of the book is wildly out of step with literally everything else that came before it. I believe the section of the book starts somewhere around the 5th hour of a total 6-hour audiobook, and it comes at you with no more setup than what I just gave here. Under normal circumstances, I would have expected at bare minimum for the Legend of the Immortals to have been brought up as somebody as an offhand comment somewhere in the first third of the book, but no. Surely we can just skate by with only mentioning the big bad, like, right before it comes up. Unless the confrontation with Jonathan was meant to be the climax of the story. So, Jonathan is the crown prince of the kingdom Alanna lives in. He's level-headed and evenly tempered and dislikes bullies and thieves, or at least he says he dislikes bullies and thieves. We'll get back to that later. For now, what you need to know is that he's a pretty milquetoast good boy, one of Alanna's best friends, and at the end of the book is about to be made a knight. So, naturally, he takes his cousin up on the not quite dare that he's been leveling at him, that's obviously meant to get him killed, and sneaks off to investigate the Black City by himself, leading Alanna to follow him into danger rather than tell any adult what they're planning to do. During the confrontation with the Immortals, one of them rips Alanna's clothes off to prove to Jonathan what her true gender is. Again, I'm not agreeing with the sentiment that genitalia equals gender, but this book is going to be like that. John does his best to ignore Alanna's nudity and what that means during the fight, but afterward they have a conversation about how she's been lying to everyone throughout the book. When I say they have a conversation, I really mean that. This is not an argument, or an accusation, or even a confrontation. It's a conversation. A mostly level-headed, earnest, and generally good faith conversation about why Alanna thought it was necessary to pretend to be a boy for the past several years. This is, weirdly enough, the poorest example of what I meant when I said that every moment of tension is being undercut by the character's never-ending reasonableness. Yes, you heard that correctly. The poorest example. Because Jonathan does have about 2 seconds where he feels hurt and betrayed by Alanna's lying. He even demands an answer for that. However, it is, unfortunately, still an example, because beyond that single demand, there are no strong emotions in this scene. Even though Jonathan disagrees with her reasons, another thing I'll get back to, he comes around 2 seconds later, now understanding that she has her reasons, and that it's her life to live as she chooses. He wishes she'll be truthful with him from now on, but he swears to keep her secret for as long as she wants him to. There is no space, not even a hesitation, between his finding out and his acceptance, which instantly kills any tension that could and should have arisen from the premise. In fact, the only moment she gets an actual rise out of him is when she insinuates that Roger purposely sent Jonathan to die here. A statement which is met with a vehemence that seems thoroughly out of character for Jonathan heretofore and is never remarked upon again. But there are other better examples. For instance, the first friend who found out Alanna's secret was George, the so-called King of Thieves. I mentioned previously that one of the plot points in the book is Alanna's first menstrual cycle, which feels like a strange sort of plot point only because prior to her waking up covered in blood, she was professed to be a well-trained healer who was shown to be more competent than an entire room full of adults dealing with a plague. Post-pandemic, this is more plausible to me than it might have been otherwise, except that at least one of the adults she was ordering around was himself a fully trained healer who acted like the idea of having people stand around a sick person crying and wailing won't help them rest was a revolutionary concept. The woman who taught her also asked in the beginning, when she was told about Alanna's plan, whether or not Alanna understood that when she quote-unquote became a woman, i.e. began menstruating, it would present a problem to her disguise. And Alanna directly told her that, yeah, she understood, and she knew how to deal with it when it became an issue. only to then act like she has literally no concept of what menstruating is when it happens. Yeah, Alanna could have been lying or misunderstanding the question, but the healer would know what she did or didn't teach her own student. If they had never touched on the subject, she would know that Alanna was lying. Alanna's plot dimension aside, she runs to George asking for his help finding a healer she can trust with her secret, necessitating that she reveal herself to him as well. He is immediately fine with it and helps her on her quest. They eventually have a sit-down discussion, but that discussion, like the one she has with Jonathan later, heavily implies that there is literally no reason for Alanna to be masquerading herself the way she is. I'm going to put a pin in that last comment for just 1 second in order to return to my original point about the conversation with Jonathan not feeling like a proper climax to the book's plot, which is, technically speaking, the end cap on the issue that was raised in the first chapter, i.e. Alanna's true identity being revealed and what consequences that will bear. But it feels incomplete. The obvious reason why it feels incomplete is that her masquerade isn't over. The book ends directly after that conversation, with no additional characters outside of Jonathan, George, and George's mother, conveniently the healer he found for her, learning Alanna's secret. Though one more person is eventually drawn into her confidence during the second book, Alanna's masquerade continues until her wardrobe malfunctions mid-duel with Roger. She doesn't even make the choice to come forward in the end. It's made for her. The less obvious but conjoined reason is that, well, a book's climax is supposed to be a climax, a release of tension. But there is no tension, ergo there cannot be a release. Book 1 simply meanders its way through several vaguely related situations without real rhyme or reason. Then it stops. The end. Just to make my case, here are some other examples of the complete lack of tension in no particular order. 1. Shortly after meeting George, the King of Thieves, Alanna decides to bring her friend Gary, a duke's son, to meet him. Gary immediately identifies George as the highly wanted criminal he allegedly is, and says he should turn George in, but also says that he won't because he finds George a likable fellow. He's obviously not lying about this, because no one ever tries to arrest George. 2. A little while later, Alanna introduces George to Jonathan. Once again, Jonathan, who is allegedly bound by the laws of chivalry which demand that he arrest any and all thieves, in addition to his being the crown-freaking prince of the realm, immediately identifies George as a thief who he ought to arrest, but George says, "You're not going to because I'm charming." And so Jonathan doesn't. When Alanna is being bullied by one of the other pages, she does get in trouble for fighting. Except, not really. Because even though she's given a relatively soft punishment, she can tell that the Duke is actually on her side and doesn't think any less of her for fighting, which is what really matters to her. 4. When Alanna is allowed to go on the Squire's only field trip at the end of the book, despite still being a page, none of the other pages are jealous of her at all for getting special treatment, and yes, the book actually does waste 2 paragraphs assuring us that this is 100% definitely not a problem. 5. Somewhere around midway through the book, George and Alanna have a relatively small argument for about half a page where George misunderstands something Alanna said that made it seem like she wanted to keep him around as her pet assassin. She immediately identifies the misunderstanding and corrects his assumption, and they return to being best friends. 6. I keep referring to George as the alleged King of Thieves because the book certainly keeps calling him a thief. A master thief, in fact, at only 17 years of age, but never once shows him actually steal anything. Over the course of both books, Alanna gifts Alanna and Jonathan several items each, including a pair of expensive horses, which, yeah, Books of the Fan will point out, Jonathan technically paid for, but he also technically paid less than they were worth. But each time George gives them anything, Alanna and Jonathan make a point of reminding him that they will not accept stolen goods, and he assures them that these goods are not stolen, going as far as producing evidence to prove that they aren't, because he knows they wouldn't like it. I will put a caveat on this one, because if we find out in a later book that George was lying the whole time, I'll be happy to be proven wrong. Currently, it doesn't seem that way. And finally, because I can't remember what number I was on, the book ends with Jonathan and Alanna still laying out in the desert, resting after their battle, so we never get to see what, if any, consequences are levied at them for having snuck out to their certain doom in the middle of the night and then remained missing for an entire day. It just ends. Alright. Circling back to that pen I placed a bit ago, I mentioned that George and Jonathan both imply, accidentally or on purpose, that there is no point to Alanna's cross-dressing. They question, repeatedly, why she feels the need to do this, and Alanna continuously replies that she wants to be a knight, but girls can't be knights. To which both boys argue that she's just as good as any of the other boys, and therefore it shouldn't be a problem. These conversations are, for lack of a better word, maddening. Either the boys are meant to be so far up their own asses that they are literally not listening to what she's saying, or, and unfortunately this is the answer I lean toward, the author couldn't stomach writing in actual misogyny from any of her multitudinous male characters, other than the evil ones, which has the unfortunate side effect of making misogyny seem like something women invented as a tool for oppressing themselves and their fellow women. The calls coming from inside the house, as it were. By and large, meaning outside of 2, possibly 3 relatively minor incidents, the only characters which express any actual disdain for the concept of a woman becoming a knight are other women. Alanna constantly talks about how she isn't like other girls and doesn't want to be a girl, right up until she decides she wants to wear dresses anyway, though that is also the point in the book where the only other female character of her same age with an actual presence in the book is essentially a pick-me girl. Other older female characters who are good chide Alanna for not engaging with her feminine side enough, while literally every female character who is bad practically screams obscenities at her and does stuff like the aforementioned forced stripping of Alanna's clothes to reveal her true gender. They mock her for wanting to be a knight. They call her weak and delicate and other gendered insults in the handful of scenes they're allowed to exist in. Meanwhile, the absolute army of male characters who know about Alanna's secret are completely positive about her gender. There's exactly one instance of Coram objecting to her plan by saying, "But you're a girl! Girls can't be knights," in the first book. And Alanna's bully makes some comments about Alanna being small and weak as a girl. But outside of those incidents, gendered insults do not happen among the male characters. Adding to this, there are no direct consequences shown or even outlined in regards to Alanna's subterfuge. Her plan from the first chapter is simply, I will pretend to be Alan until I take my test and am formally inducted into the Knight's Order, then I will reveal myself and they'll just have to accept me. This is a woefully naive plan, but one that is expected from the 11-year-old she was at the time. I was fully on board with that being her plan. What didn't make sense to me was the adults in her life hearing this and none of them saying something like, "You're aware you'll be put to death when they find out the truth, right?" Or, "You're aware that you're risking imprisonment for lying to the king or being sent to a sanitarium, right?" Or, at the absolute bare minimum, you'll completely sink your family's reputation, which will have long-term consequences, not just for you, but for everyone who relies on your family to survive. But they don't. They let her go through with this masquerade, even though the assumed necessity of it implies, at bare minimum, that what she's doing is horrendously socially unacceptable. But no consequences come up. Ever. The only moment where this almost doesn't bear true is right at the end of book 2, when her wardrobe malfunctions. The king is clearly outraged, but all he manages to say or do is shout, "What is the meaning of this?" before his reaction is hand waved away and we return to beating up Roger. Admittedly, Roger deserves that, but still. After Alanna wins, the scene immediately cuts to a few days later. No consequences are discussed beyond a vague sense that Alanna should wait until they get over it to return to the city. I'm left, then, with the conclusion that absolutely none of this was necessary from the jump. That Alanna could have just shown up at the gates as herself, and everyone may have been slightly weirded out at first, but they would have accepted it. While there could be an argument to be made that she did this because her father was adamantly set against her being a knight, he, again, died before the second book began. If he was actually a concern, she could have revealed herself after his funeral, because the new lord of their house, her brother, is completely on board with her plans. To me, all of this spirals into a deep, unsettling implication that misogyny isn't real, or if it is, it doesn't have a tangible impact on anyone's life beyond the impact they allow it to have. It's the same feeling I had when, in the Percy Jackson series, Nico accurately calls out Camp Half-Blood for being distinctly unwelcoming and bigoted against him and his sister for being the children of Hades, only to have his own love interest feed him some bullshit about how that was just in his head, as though it wasn't literally evidenced in the earlier books. I find myself deeply frustrated when media, any form of media, but particularly kids media, presents like they want to have a serious discussion about how these issues impact people through their characters, only to pull back at the last minute, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, and isn't the poor MC just so silly for shooting themselves in the foot all these years? Didn't they know they can just do whatever they want without any repercussions or consequences? This is why I'm fairly certain I wouldn't have cared for this series as a child. While I understand that it's easy for me to say this now, I never cared for people oversimplifying what ought to be complicated situations, especially when it comes to media like these books, which often drift toward moralizing territory in other regards. I mean, for example, Alanna can sense evil. Like, part of her magic gift is apparently a spell of detect good and evil that is constantly up and allows her to instantly clock any villain she sets her eyes on. Admittedly, it's not hard. This series' villains tend to stand around twirling their mustaches while delivering soliloquies about their evil plans. They stop shy of calling themselves evil, at least, but it's difficult to read a scene where the pick-me girl laments that she had the prince in the palm of my hand while she's sitting at the big bad's knee, having her hair petted like Dr. Claw's cat, and not sense an underlying message of, you'll know evil when you see it in all its over-the-top glory. The evil people are the ones who call Alanna out on her gender. The good ones are literally everybody else who obviously don't do that because they're not evil. I don't want to get into the habit of suggesting fixes, but I'm going to. What the books really needed was to slow the hell down and actually show us how the guys interacted with Alanna on the daily. We needed them to make fun of her for being small and tiny, like a girl. We needed them to be mean nearly as often as they were kind. We needed them to be flawed, and for Alanna to have the same damn flaws, and for the group to confront those flaws together. More to the point, we needed someone good to have an inexcusably bad reaction to her reveal, which then gets handled over the course of several interactions, not in the same breath. But that's not the books we got. Instead, we got the books where both of Alanna's primary love interests assault her, and it's treated like a good thing. Yeah, you thought I wasn't going to get to that, didn't you? So, this, I think, is going to be the last negative thing I touch on, because this has been going on for a while, but it's kind of a big one. I mentioned once before that in the first book, I found George and Jonathan to be largely interchangeable personality-wise. For better or worse, this doesn't hold true by the second book. To be fair, inconsistent characterization is an issue throughout both books for multiple characters. Alanna herself is only smart, in the sense of successfully logics her way through problems instead of just hitting them, when the plot demands it, before immediately reverting back to a proper D&D barbarian. But there are other smaller issues. For example, a moment in the later half of book 1 where she swears that Duke Garrett makes her nervous whenever he's around, despite her having previously said that she loves having him around and is always happy to see him, and her previously having the audacity to order him around a sick room like he was the page and she was the Duke. There's a side character named Raoul who spent the first half of the book loudly and obnoxiously begging the go-ahead to beat up Alanna's bully for her, and then is later recharacterized as being big but very shy and quiet. The opening of the book also swears that Alanna and Tom are both pranksters, but that personality trait never actually surfaces. So, that's a thing. But what happens with the George versus Jonathan debacle is a bit more, dare I say it, nuanced. Surprising absolutely no one, both George and Jonathan begin developing feelings for Alanna sometime after finding out that she's a girl. She's unperceptive of this, pretty much forever, but both guys insist that they individually are meant to be with her. For George, this means becoming an incorrigible flirt, but otherwise remaining steadfast in his easygoing, mostly pressure-free personality. Jonathan, on the other hand, swiftly becomes an asshole wherever Alanna is concerned. It starts like any true 80s romance, with bullying that's meant to be romantic. We don't actually get to see this, mind. It's all just a few sentences of exposition, but the narrator notes that Jonathan becomes alternately cold and warm toward Alanna, insisting that she shows up to court events and talks and dances with the girls there, only to get angry at her in private for giving those girls false hope. He also becomes noticeably irritated whenever she talks to the other squires and pages, often accusing her of flirting with them, even though none of them know that she's a girl. However, when the two of them are in private, he's as gentle and funny and flirty as always. This eventually accumulates in two similar, but resoundingly different moments. First, George kisses Alanna. He specifically does this when she wasn't expecting it, and when her hands were full so she couldn't push him away. I admit, I'm not as offended by it as I could be. Like, within the realm of fiction, I'm perfectly willing to accept this as a cute moment, while also acknowledging that it was technically assault. Is that contradictory? Yeah. But Alanna's reaction to it, while exasperated and irritated, was also intrigued. George apologized for taking advantage of the situation, promised that he wouldn't do it again until she asked, and they moved on. Conversely, Jonathan found Alanna surreptitiously walking around the castle in a dress the night of her 17th birthday. He propositions her, pulls her into a kiss that is initially consensual. However, when she tries to pull away, he first chides and needles her into giving in, claiming that this was obviously meant to happen and that they're meant to be, etc. When that doesn't work, he eventually lets her go, but says, and this is verbatim, "Go away before I change my mind." So, after her friend and prince threatens to assault her, she retreats to her room where she has a mild existential crisis, fueled largely by the goddess's little speech about learning to love and her own fears that, since she wasn't willing, Jonathan is probably going to sleep with Pick Me Girl, before she ultimately decides that She's into assault threats, apparently. And then she starts sleeping with Jonathan on the regular. Okay. There's a lot more I could say, a lot more, but we're getting to the point where it's starting to sound like there's no good to be found in these books, and I don't think that's true. So I'd like to touch, albeit briefly, because this video is already too long, on the positive side. To begin with, while I do wish this were handled in actual scenes rather than being largely expository, Alanna is an extremely willful girl who puts in a lot of hard work into achieving her goals. There are issues surrounding aspects of this, but the takeaway is that she rarely begins with can't. Instead, she seeks information, formulates a plan, and then sticks to those plans for weeks, sometimes months or years before they come into fruition. That is hugely admirable and makes her genuinely interesting as a character, particularly in the context of the time where many books written for girls focused on protagonists that were still largely concerned with more traditionally feminine lifestyles and or largely got things handed to them purely by magic alone. There's also the book's willingness to talk frankly about sexual health. Attitudes toward SA aside, this series, like the Judy Blume series before it, dared to talk openly and earnestly about puberty and gender during a point in time when that was practically unheard of outside of particular subsets of adult literary fiction. I definitely see why Tamora went on to say that Alanna is more accurately genderqueer. Many sections of the book which concern Alanna's struggles with her gender read like body dysmorphia in a way that's unusual to find outside of pointedly queer spaces. Similarly, the book has a distinctly sex-positive attitude that's never explicitly called to attention, but is also overtly there. The Pick-Me Girl and Alanna both have active sex lives as teenagers, with the former explicitly and merrily making rounds among the boys without the narrative shaming them for having their fun. This can be a little jarring given the way that these settings are usually written, and does ultimately feed into the issue of Alanna's internalized misogyny seemingly popping into existence of its own accord, but it is also refreshing to not have to deal with the barrage of slut-shaming for once. In the end, I don't know. The books were weirdly nostalgic in a way that doesn't really make sense since I never read them as a kid. I can only assume that has to do with the attitudes toward gender, identity, relationships, and unless I forget, because this does vaguely come up in that last section of the first book, ethnicity, all being of their time, aka my childhood. They could also be very fun at their best moments, usually moments like the ones that I've drawn for you here. This scene, I hope, does some small amount of justice to the duel between Alla of Trabond and Dane of Melor. This duel took place toward the beginning of the second book and precipitated the war that eats up the middle half. It was one of my favorite moments in the book, where tiny Squire Alanna is asked to fight for her country's honor against the arrogant Toussaint Knight. He wins the duel by drawing first blood, but he doesn't stop there, instead attempting to kill Alanna for the insult of Jonathan making him fight a child. And then she wipes the floor with his ass, proving to everyone that she had actually been holding back to spare his dignity. I admit, I may have taken the term fencing a little too literally here, but I did enjoy the idea of like a Three Musketeers-esque fight and rather than an all-out brawl for this scene. Alright, so, I have no idea how to end something like this. If The Song of the Lioness was a series that meant something to you, and you either agree with or fundamentally loathe everything I just said, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to discuss it. If you've never read the series but are interested in finding out for yourself how you feel, consider checking it out at your local library. They almost certainly have a copy. I haven't decided what I'll be tackling for next week. The front runners right now were the second half of The Song of the Lioness or The Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. Don't forget to ignore the like button, and I don't know why you'd want to subscribe to this hot mess, but if you do, then I guess I'll see you next week. Bye-bye!